Ratcliffe Highway. It's simply known as the Highway these days. But in the 1810s, it was probably the exact picture that enters your mind when you imagine a vintage lower-class London sector. A dark, dank section of a city populated by a mixture of downtrodden and working-class people. The borough rests in London's East End, right along the Thames River, inviting a pretty diverse cultural clash, all the while being known for its rampant poverty and just as well for its brothels and opium dens. It's what you'd call seedy at first glance, but in reality, a multitude of working people and families called Ratcliffe Highway home. It's still there, right through the Tower Hamlets, connecting Whitechapel and Limehouse. But you probably wouldn't guess the past it once had compared to what you'd see today. But despite those changes, an unshakable air of brutality and tragedy continues to linger. Similar to that of Whitechapel, where Jack the Ripper's horrific streak took place many decades later. Even then, over 200 years later, what happened in 1811 still evokes eerie feelings of macabre. "29 Ratcliffe Highway, December 7th. A linen draper's shop with an upstairs living quarters is still active with business, but close to closing its doors. It was occupied by the Marr family, consisting of the patriarch, Timothy Marr, an ex-sailor with the East India Company, his wife, Celia, and their 14-week-old baby, Timothy Jr. Along with them was Timothy's apprentice, a young man by the name of James Gowan, and lastly, Margaret Jewell, a servant for the family. And it was Margaret who would provide the perspective that kicked off an absolutely horrifying picture. It was slightly before midnight, and the activity around the highway was noticeably higher due to the incoming Christmas business. So despite the hour, the borough wasn't deathly silent. The mystery begins when the servant, Margaret Jewell, was sent out into town by Timothy to handle some last-minute errands for he and the family. The task was simply to fetch some oysters and something sweet for the still-recovering Celia, and to pay an outstanding bill to a baker over at John Hill. Now, fully reliable sources regarding the exact movements of Jewell are limited. For one, she reportedly saw a person near the shop door as she exited, but it only comes from one report. Either way, one would be inclined to believe that she did, based on what happened next. Margaret carried out her chore, first heading out to the oyster shop, but despite the late-night bustle, she found that the shop was closed, so she redirected herself to the bakery to cover the bill. The trip there required her to pass the Marr's linen shop yet again, and when she looked and noticed Timothy through the window, still busying himself with closing up shop, this was the last time Margaret would see him alive. After making her way to the baker's, she also found it was closed, so she made one final attempt to get a hold of some oysters. Margaret tried her luck at one last store, but it too was closed. So with that, she headed back to the linen shop, unsuccessful. When she arrived at the Marrs again, just 20 minutes after midnight, the servant found that the shop's lights she'd just seen a moment ago were off. The building was now black as night, the shutters already drawn. It was a confusing sight. What are the chances the family would forget their servant while she's out fetching food? It was odd, but not alarming. Margaret approached the door and found that it was locked, following it up with a knock. No one answered, but she didn't receive complete silence. She heard footsteps that sounded like they were coming from the stairs, so she assumed it was someone coming down to answer her knock. This was not the case. A cry from Timothy Jr. came from the upstairs room, and her fear escalated. Margaret began banging relentlessly on the door now, becoming even more frightened being left outside. A report saying she heard footsteps just behind her. The commotion was so jarring that it captured the attention of George Olney, a local night watchman. When he came to check, Margaret explained what had been happening. prompting George to knock on the door himself and yell out to the Marr family, with no more luck than Margaret had. With the commotion intensifying even more, yet another person approached the scene, this time being the Marr family's next-door neighbor, John Murray, a pawnbroker. He'd gotten so concerned that he jumped the connecting fence in hopes of gaining access to the house. The first thing he noticed was their back door was completely open and that a light was on nearby. Murray wasted no time in scaling the rear steps of the business, calling out for Timothy and Celia, but just as before, there was no answer. But when Murray descended the flight of stairs to the linen shop on the first floor, he would, quite literally, stumble on something truly traumatizing. Right by the stairs, the battered body of James Gowan, Timothy's apprentice, was found bludgeoned to death so badly that bits of gray matter painted the walls, along with his own blood. His face had been completely smashed in. The pawnbroker was horrified. He frantically hurried towards the front door to let the watchman in, but he tripped over yet another body, the body of Celia Marr, whose corpse was face down, head pummeled much like James, her wound still bleeding heavily. John Murray scrambled back up, finally managing to open the door for George Olney to let him inside and urge Margaret not to follow them in. Together, the pair of men searched for Timothy Sr., but alas, he was dead as well, beaten to death by some tool like the other two, right behind his own counter. That only left one person left to check for, 14-week-old Timothy Jr. upstairs. The men rushed up the flight of steps and into the living quarters to check on the boy. And, as if this tragedy couldn't become more morbid, it did. Right there in his own crib, Timothy had suffered the same fate as his parents, sharing similar head wounds by the unknown murder weapon, as well as having his throat slashed so deep that the wound nearly decapitated him. And just like that, the Marr family, plus their young apprentice, had been murdered in one of the most brutal ways possible. Had Margaret Jewell not been sent on those errands not even an hour before, it would have been very likely that she'd share the same fate. A crowd had gathered outside, as well as the Thames River police. They scoured the building, looking for anything to take them closer to the killer or killers responsible. And although the perpetrator had already fled, police found what exactly they'd used to carry out the grisly attack. Upstairs in the baby's room lay the blood-soaked murder weapon, a hammer-like tool called a maul, which is commonly used for shipbuilders. It was leaning against a chair, and atop the bloodstains also had human hair stuck to the flat side of the tool, meant for hammering nails. But for it to be left there next to a victim indicated that the killer left in a hurry. Another important detail is that the linen shop wasn't robbed, or at least the intruder didn't have time to. No items had been taken, and the equivalent of 152 pounds were found in the bedroom drawer. The last bit of evidence were 2 sets of bloody footprints found exiting the aforementioned back door that was found wide open. The red prints also had bits of sawdust in them, from some carpentry work done earlier that day in the building. From what police could put together, servant Margaret Jewell had been sent out just barely before the attack on the family began, and when she came back, the last part of the massacre was still in progress. Like she told the watchman, she'd heard little Timothy Jr. crying upstairs when knocking, and it's strongly believed that this was during the infant's senseless murder. The footsteps she heard following this was likely when the intruder rushed downstairs to exit through the back door. They'd also left the bloody maul in the bedroom as a result of being startled by Margaret's knocks, feeling they had to leave immediately. With the footsteps being so fresh, a posse quickly followed the direction they went, which led them to a street just behind the house, where an apparent witness claimed to have seen a gang of some 10-odd men running from the murder scene's direction. This was an unfounded report, nor would it be the last of them. For the time being, the authorities believed they were dealing with two people based on the prints. Some arrests were made that night, mainly on the basis of witness reports, but they each fell flat. One of the detained was Timothy Marr's own brother, who some had rumored he had a quarrel with, but he was later ruled out after providing a solid alibi. For now, the bloody maul used in the crime was taken back to the police station. As if this story couldn't get any more morbid, the brutalized bodies of the Marr family, minus Timothy Jr., and apprentice James Gowan, were paraded through the streets of London, following an inquest at a public house called the Jolly Sailor. It was a common practice at the time for circumstances like these, both as a way to collectively mourn and hopefully gather further information had anyone recognized the bodies. Afterwards, they were buried together in St. George, marking a tragic end for a young family and leaving a bitter taste in the mouth of Londoners, far and wide, so close to Christmas. Even scarier, the person or persons responsible for this nightmare were still out there. Nor would it be the last time they'd carry out such an atrocity. Later on, the gory maul that wrought so much havoc was finally cleaned off by police, revealing a set of initials, JP, or perhaps IP, was carved into the handle. It wasn't much, but it was something. Perhaps it could be traced to a ship. But on that very same day the initials were discovered, December 19th, the second slaying commenced, this time happening at the King's Arms Tavern, located on Garnet Street today. The King's Tavern was owned and operated by 56-year-old John Williamson, accompanied by his wife, 60-year-old Elizabeth, their 14-year-old granddaughter Kitty, and Bridget Anna Harrington, a servant of the establishment, somewhere in her 50s. And even though this was a pub in a place as active as the Ratcliffe Highway, it was one of the lesser trafficked establishments in the borough, since John preferred to close down early each night. There's an interesting perspective relayed by a tenant of the taverns, a man by the name of John Turner, a journeyman who'd been lodging in one of the upstairs rooms for about 8 months. He was the sole individual able to tell what happened that fateful night. At the time John tells his story, the couple and servant were still downstairs, more than likely putting things away and prepping the establishment for tomorrow's business. Catherine Stillwell, or Kitty, their granddaughter, had gone to sleep in her upstairs room by then. John, who'd gone to bed at around 10:40 p.m., just began to get some shut-eye before being awoken by the loud sound of the tavern's front door slamming wide open, followed by a series of screams. The first scream coming from the servant woman, Bridget, apparently yelling, "We're all murdered," followed by John Williamson screaming, "I am a dead man," then a series of gut-wrenching impacts. John Turner listened to all of this from his bedroom. The shaken man yielded for a few minutes before deciding what to do next. He opened the door to his room, careful not to make any noise, and crept cautiously down the steps, far enough to lean down and investigate what just happened. He told police that, very clearly, he saw the corpse of Elizabeth Williamson on the floor of the tavern, and a notably tall man, wearing a dark-colored Flushing coat, rummaging through her pockets. This was enough for him to turn back, go upstairs, and return to his room. Thinking quickly, and realizing it would be foolish to try and flee from the front door, John Turner took advantage of this situation by utilizing his room window as an alternative. With that settled, he stripped his bed of 2 sheets, tied them together, and literally climbed his way down the second-floor window. An obviously bizarre sight from the outside, a large crowd began to form outside the building to see this nearly naked man scale the exterior. John began shouting, "Murder! Murder!" to the people down below, causing an even bigger scene. A local constable came forward to inspect the bustle, and at this point, the message was clear that something terrible had happened inside. Some members of the crowd took it upon themselves to break through the front door, where they bore witness to a scene eerily similar to that of the Marr family. The first victim in sight was John Williamson. He was found right by the staircase, lying on his back. His face had been beaten in, his hand nearly severed, and his throat cut. Lying beside him was a crowbar, which was believed to be at least one of the weapons used. Further back into the tavern parlor lay the bodies of both Elizabeth Williamson and servant Bridget Anna Harrington, who had both died from similar blunt force trauma. Their skulls had been pummeled, and both their throats were slit as well. Elizabeth's literally being cut down to the bone. Miraculously, granddaughter Catherine Stillwell was found upstairs, still asleep in her bed. She had absolutely no clue what had taken place just below her. Now, despite John Turner's point of view, police determined that the intruder gained access to the building via cellar door based on nearby bloodstains, and just how generally easier it would have been than simply bashing through the front door. This also presents the question if the killer managed to close and lock the door behind him, since the crowd of people had no choice but to force their way in. Either way, John was now considered a suspect in the case. Even stranger was another detail. John Williamson, the tavern owner, happened to tell the exact same constable that arrived on scene slightly earlier to keep an eye out for a man that seemed to be loitering near the business entrances and listening to the door. He was wearing a brown coat. A rear window was open, and that's what elicited authorities to believe that this was the suspect's escape route. Adding on to that, there was a muddy footprint just beyond the window, and the land beyond that consisted of a slope covered in clay. Keeping this in mind, the public and police kept on the lookout for the supposed tall man spotted by John that might have a muddy outfit on. London Bridge, the primary passageway over the River Thames, was completely locked down to prevent potential escape. And London's own Bow Street runners, considered London's first police force, searched the Ratcliffe Highway from top to bottom. Similar to the Marr family murders, it's still unclear whether or not the Williamsons were truly subject to a robbery that night. A solid guess is that both crime scenes had intended to be robberies, but both had been interrupted in their own way. Margaret Jewell knocking on the door, and John Turner making the scene out front. There was a stronger sign of this in regards to the King's Arms Tavern, as John Williamson's pocket watch was missing, which John Turner confirmed. 100 guineas were offered as a reward for any information about the killings, with smaller rewards being offered in separate parishes. Eventually, a group of suspects were brought in for questioning that could have had connections with the Marr or Williamson families, a couple of which we'll get to later, but the most notable of the group was a young man by the name of John Williams, who also went by John Murphy. Williams was indeed an interesting character, and after police learned about a series of coincidences between both murders with the man, he of all others became the point of focus for these crimes. Williams, 27, was either of Scottish or Irish heritage, about 5'9", and worked as a seaman. He'd recently almost perished from a failed mutiny at that. Ratcliffe Highway was a tight community, and word got around about people. And even though it's impossible present day to learn the concrete facts, it was said that John actually knew Timothy Marr from the linen shop back when they worked for the East India Company. Rumor had it that John and Timothy may have had an unfinished quarrel with one another when they worked together, but the reasoning is truly anyone's guess. If not that, there was a chance that John might have been acquainted with the Marrs via their actual business. Williams was a maritime worker, and Marr's haberdashery was already close to the docks. But there was another, even stranger link between Timothy and John that raised more suspicion. A carpenter named Cornelius Hart, the same carpenter that Timothy Marr had hired to work on his business the same day of the murders. You may remember the bloody footprints containing shavings during the search. Cornelius had not only been there that same day, but he'd actually returned to the scene of the crime to retrieve a chisel he'd left behind earlier that day. Technically, he removed potential evidence. But in a way, this wasn't the strangest part. Cornelius Hart also happened to know John Williams from his own days as a sailor, where both men worked on the same ship. Still a coincidence? Furthermore, Cornelius even sent a message to the police asking them whether or not his old crewmate would be detained. However, despite the questionable connection with the Mars, it would be the King's Arms Tavern killings that would put forward more compelling evidence. Williams lived at a public house called the Pear Tree on Cinnamon Street in Old Wapping, and just beyond midnight, after the murders, John's roommate made note that he'd come home just around that time. Before then, he'd also been seen in the pub itself, drinking alongside another suspect named William Long Billy Ablas, another fellow sailor and also someone familiar with the Marr family. John Turner, the man who fled from the window that night, confirmed that the suspect had visited the tavern more than once, although he couldn't place if this was the same man he allegedly saw rifling through Mrs. Williamson's pockets when he looked down the stairs. The fact that Williams was there that night, this also raised the question whether or not he was the same loiterer that the tavern keeper, John Williamson, reported to the local constable. On the more damning side of things, the laundress at John Williams' Pear Tree lodging space was asked at the witness forum if she had ever washed any bloody clothes from the suspect. She shared that 2 weeks prior, she indeed had. There was blood in the collar of his shirt, and that it had also been torn. John defended himself by saying that this was due to a fight he had over a card game with another man. Williams also aroused suspicion when he claimed to police that he was penniless, yet some money was found on his person, as well as a pair of pawn tickets that he said were from selling off some clothing. This didn't sit well with police or the public, as it perpetuated the theory that these were robberies. John Williams was held in Cobath Fields Prison, otherwise known as Clerkenwell Jail. All of this aside, there was one last, very telling piece of evidence that put the final nail in the coffin for Williams, one that was much harder to deny: the maul. The building tool that the killer chose to use as a grisly murder weapon was found in the upstairs bedroom next to the body of Timothy Marr Jr. As I previously stated, when the blood and hair was washed off, the handle was inscribed with the initials JP or JI. It was the former. Now with John Williams in custody, authorities searched the Pear Tree lodging home for more evidence. That's when they struck gold. Because, as it turns out, a tenant by the name of John Peterson lived there as well, JP. He wasn't in the house at the moment since he was out at sea. John was also a sailor, and police searched his room for anything they could find to bring them the answers they needed, or rather, what they couldn't find. Inside Peterson's trunk, the maul was missing, and that was enough for investigators piecing together Williams' movements on top of the previous evidence. To them, he used the opportunity of John's absence to swipe his maul, murder the Marr family, leave it behind in a panic, and then murder the Williamsons 12 days later at the King's Arms Tavern with a knife and other blunt object. This, paired with the laundress's statement and John Turner placing him at the tavern, was enough to be convicted for the slayings. This much was settled, but theories persisted that John Williams had help in the murders, especially with the separate pairs of footprints leading out of the Marr residence. But there was little to nothing to bolster this theory. For the time being, Williams was to stay behind bars at Cobath Fields Prison until his trial date. The London prison was notoriously harsh, and John continued to be subjected to interrogation. Short-lived would be the celebrations of a job well done, though. On December 28th, the young John Williams was found hanging in his cell by the end of his scarf or a handkerchief. It was tied to an iron bar or fixture. It's unclear how long exactly the body was left there, but supposedly it was cold when discovered. Also, there was supposedly a piece of metal that John had broken off from his cell as an alternative weapon if hanging didn't work. As sure as authorities were about John's movements, all further answers came to an abrupt halt. To the courts, this action was perceived as an admission of guilt, but perspectives from inside the prison say otherwise. Other prisoners, including the warden of Colbath Fields, say that Williams was seemingly happy before his death, as if he was confident his name would be cleared. Theories persist that he may have been murdered behind bars to prevent exposure of possible accomplices. Either way, the court found John Williams guilty of the 7 murders between the Marr and Williamson family. The case was closed, even with a multitude of questions left unanswered. But there was one more show to be put on for the public. Come New Year's Eve, Williams' body was moved from the prison, placed on a cart, and subsequently paraded around Ratcliffe Highway, Wapping and Shadwell, in yet another bizarre post-mortem procession. Reportedly, over 180,000 people attended the dark parade. At one point, the cart stopped for a quarter hour once it crossed paths with the Marr residence, before moving to the King's Arms for a few minutes, where it said that the coachman whipped John's face 3 times. Then, they moved on to the burial site. Although he escaped death by the law, no mercy was given to the convicted man's corpse by any means. It was believed that the evil spirits of those who arose from the dead would be confused if their place of burial were at a crossroads, so that's exactly where John was buried, right down the center of Cannon Street and Cable Street. The shallow grave was intentionally dug smaller than the man's body, so that even in death, he'd be forever uncomfortable. A stake was driven into the heart to keep his spirit from wandering anywhere, and the grave was filled with quicklime for good measure. Had there been any doubts by the time he was in the ground, there was still one last find that investigators discovered that placed Williams in at least one of the murder scenes. It's still considered circumstantial, but it reinforced the idea that he was guilty. Following Williams' death, the Peachtree boarding home was searched one more time, where they found a pair of bloody stockings and the missing pocket watch belonging to the slain Mr. Williamson. Those stockings supposedly belonged to the Marr family's linen shop to boot. Putting aside the evidence and sheer persistence by police, the ultimate verdict of the Ratcliffe Highway murders leaves behind a lot more questions than it does answers. John Williams definitely had a lot going against him, but one of the most burning questions was if he truly was the sole perpetrator in both these killings. He had the Shroud of Darkness on his side for an ambush, that's certain. But could one man pull this off twice in such a brutal way with so much efficiency? And what about the robbery angle? Did John really slaughter these people, including an infant, just to steal? Or was this a crime of passion, rooted in something that only a silent few knew about? Whatever the case, December 1811 harbored an unnecessarily bloody holiday season for London, one that still hadn't been forgotten over 200 years later. August 1886. More than 70 years later, a gas company operating an excavation on Cannon Street and Cable Street accidentally unearthed the gravesite of John Williams. Inside the plot, the skeletal remains of the accused man lay face down, with the wooden stake still lodged in the chest area. Nearly a century following his public procession, new eyes looked upon the man that very well could have brought an early death to 7. Right across the street from this find was a pub known as the Crown and Dolphin. When the landlord of the establishment caught wind of the find, he took it upon himself to keep William's skull as a bizarre keepsake. To this very day, No one knows where the skull is located.